Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Paul Rennie, CEO of Paradigm Biopharmaceuticals Limited. I'd like to welcome you all to Paradigm's Investor Update to discuss the recent response from the US FDA. Today's meeting is being held online via the Lumi platform, where attendees can watch a live webcast of the meeting. In addition, shareholders have the ability to ask questions, which will be answered following the presentation. Questions can be submitted at any time throughout the presentation. To ask a question, press or click the speech bubble icon. This will open a new screen. At the bottom of the screen, there will be a section for you to type in your question. Once you've finished typing, please hit the arrow symbol to send. Please note that while you can submit a question any time from now on, Paradigm will not address the question until the relevant time in the meeting. Please also note that your questions will be moderated, or if we receive multiple questions on the one topic, they'll be amalgamated together. Finally, due to time constraints, we may run out of time to answer all your questions. Next slide, please. Our standard disclaimer applies to this presentation. Now, from my perspective, I see the situation with the FDA as progressing from 6 questions down to now 1 question for Paradigm to answer. And we are very confident that we can respond to the FDA within the month. I would now like to hand over to my colleague, Dr. Donna Skerritt, who is Paradigm's Chief Medical Officer, who will take you through a presentation which will take between 15 and 20 minutes. After the presentation, Paradigm's Chief Financial Officer, Justin Cahill, will read out your questions submitted via the Lumi platform. And thank you again for joining our presentation. I'll pass over to you now, Donna.
Thank you, Paul. Next slide, please. The first thing I'd like to go over for you today is what our approach has been to this program. We have sought to define global harmonization for our protocol, and we started that process in February of 2020 with the pre-IND meeting at the FDA. As a result of that meeting, Paradigm conducted 26 additional non-clinical evaluations, and these were to provide a toxicology profile for the injectable PPS formulation. Prior profiles submitted to the FDA were for the oral formulation. Following that meeting in February, we met in September with EMA, and we sought scientific advice regarding the design of the protocol. And the feedback from the EMA allowed us to confirm the clinical trial design was acceptable. We then moved forward with clinical trial design and submitted our trial to the FDA in December of 2020 through a Type C meeting. And in this meeting, we received confirmation from the FDA, getting their view on the primary endpoint, the patient population, the statistical analysis plan, and the safety population. This then allowed us to compile all of the clinical information as well as the new non-clinical information to an IND, which was submitted in the first quarter of 2021. The goals of the OA clinical trial program are shown at the bottom of this slide. The overall goals are to confirm the minimally effective dose, to evaluate increased patient numbers to account for potential dropouts that may be related to COVID-19, an aged population, and also meet regulatory requirements to collect adequate safety data for injectable PPS. The studies will also measure confirmed clinical endpoints of WOMAC pain and function, and confirm the phase 3 pivotal as well as confirmatory study data, providing evidence of treatment effect in 2 studies. We also intend to improve and expand the label for simultaneous registration globally. And so that's one of the main objectives of seeking the input from multiple global authorities before beginning the studies. Next slide, please. So the FDA IND process is outlined on this slide. As I mentioned, in Q1, we submitted the IND to the FDA. We were expecting a response from the FDA within 30 days, which is the required response time. Close to the end of that 30-day review period, we received a telephone call from the FDA. During that call, we were advised that the FDA needed an additional 30 days to submit the questions to Paradigm. They said to us they did have a few questions for the study and they would send those within the next 30-day period. We received those questions on the 25th of May. And the questions were 6 questions from the agency, principally relating to the recently completed non-clinical studies. So as I mentioned, there were 26 new non-clinical studies in this IND. They were designed to answer questions, general and some specific questions about the toxicity profile as much as can be gained from animal studies. And so the IND contained a lot of new non-clinical information. Paradigm then took those questions and worked internally and with our expert consultants to respond to the FDA. That response went to the FDA on June 30th, and that gave the FDA another 30 days to review Paradigm's responses to the agency. On July 30th, Paradigm received a written response from the US FDA. In that response, the agency accepted responses to 5 of the 6 questions received. The FDA then said they needed further clarification on 1 prior question. So this is 1 out of the 6 questions that we answered for the FDA. They're requesting further clarification on. Next slide, please. So what is our pathway forward? Paradigm responded to the 6 questions initially posed by the FDA. The agency feedback we just received contained 1 outstanding question that requires clarification. This question relates to 1 of the GLP preclinical studies completed in rats. And Paradigm intends to respond to the FDA within the month, and that response will include clarification on the non-clinical finding the FDA is referring to, as well as a mitigation plan in the protocol. I'd like to just add some additional comments at this point. The process of submitting the IND, receiving questions, going back and receiving need for clarification around more questions is something that we expect in a program like osteoarthritis, where the indication will impact a very large patient population. And therefore, a thorough and iterative process with the FDA for initiating the registration study is common practice. The pace of this experience has been rather slow due to changes in communication with the FDA, mostly due to the presence of the COVID-19 pandemic. And that is that all of the interactions since the initial pre-IND meeting have been written responses with obligate 30-day response periods on the FDA side. Despite this, we're confident that we will address the FDA's 1 remaining question, and we look forward to resolving this outstanding issue so we can move forward with the program. Next slide, please. So I mentioned that osteoarthritis is something that is of impact due to its presence in a large population. Well, how large is that population? It's a blockbuster market opportunity. Xylitol aims to meet a significant unmet need in osteoarthritis. If you look at the key markets, about 72 million people are affected by osteoarthritis. 69% of them have knee or hip arthritis or a combination of those. And importantly, 81% of patients are dissatisfied with their current treatments. They try a multiple of conservative therapies, oral medications, and still complain of pain and difficulty with functioning, and so describe their treatment regimens as unsatisfactory. Next slide, please. So Paradigm's program aims to provide a treatment for the unmet need in osteoarthritis. As I mentioned, it's a global harmonized program with plans to treat patients on the study in the US, Australia, and Europe. Just a snapshot of the activity in this region is shown on this slide. In Australia, we have 8 sites that have been selected. The protocol has received ethics approval. Paradigm has begun contracting sites in Western Australia, Victoria, South Wales, South Australia, and Queensland. Screening of participants in the study will commence in Q4, and our lead investigator has been assigned and confirmed. In Europe, we have 6 sites that will be initiated initially, and Paradigm is finalizing discussions with our lead investigator. In the United States, we have approximately 56 sites that have been selected. We are meeting with clinical and non-clinical experts to respond to the FDA's outstanding question. Our lead investigator has been confirmed for the US as well. Next slide, please. It's important also to keep in mind other clinical activity that is ongoing at Paradigm. On the left side of the slide, Para-008 is a study that is enrolling subjects now in Australia. This is a study in osteoarthritis that will evaluate biomarkers looking for changes from baseline in multiple objective measures associated with disease progression of OA. And this will allow us to explore the relationship between biomarkers and clinical endpoints in OA. The study is currently underway at 1 site in Box Hill, Victoria. It will randomize 60 participants to receive PPS or placebo, and to date, this exploratory trial is approximately 50% recruited. In Australia, we are also enrolling in a study in mucopolysaccharidosis type 1. We have an open label trial currently enrolling up to 10 subjects who are dosed weekly for 12 weeks and then every other week for a total of 52 weeks. This is underway at Women and Children's Hospital in Adelaide, and the primary endpoint is safety. Key secondary endpoints are pain and function, as well as pharmacokinetics. 3 subjects are currently in treatment, and enrollment of an additional patients is ongoing. PPS to date has been well tolerated in this trial. On the right of the slide is our activity with mucopolysaccharidosis type 6 in Brazil. This is a double-blind placebo-controlled trial which will evaluate 12 subjects who will be dosed weekly for 24 weeks. The primary endpoint here is safety, with key secondary endpoints being pain and function. The Brazilian Regulatory Agency, Anvisa, and Brazilian Ethics Committee have approved Paradigm's clinical program and study endpoints, and this program will be updated to the public in the 3rd quarter of this year. Next slide, please. In addition to our lead program, which is in osteoarthritis, I've mentioned our activity in MPS. We also have ongoing exploratory preclinical work, proof of concept work being done for future PPS indications. And this work is being done in ARDS as well as in heart failure. So we're widening our pipeline, looking for other indications for PPS as we move forward with osteoarthritis. OA is obviously the lead program and the main focus of our clinical activity. Next slide, please. So I will now turn over to Justin Cahill, our CFO, for management of the questions. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Donna. Now that we've concluded the formal presentation, we can open up our Q&A session. The first question we have is, how does the FDA response impact the clinical timeline?
Thank you, Justin. The review process as the FDA, although longer than we initially anticipated or would like to have experienced, will pose a slight delay in the overall clinical program timelines. We're working to find ways to reduce the timeline, and an update will be provided to the market at the time when we've worked out the overall strategy to reduce the overall program time, and that may include additional site initiation. It also includes our moving forward with initiation of participant activity in Australia and Europe while we clear this one remaining issue with the FDA.
Thanks, Donna. The second question we have is a finance question, so I can handle that response. The question reads, what impact does the FDA response have on our cash position? Paradigm reported in our Appendix 4C disclosure last week, we currently have $71 million cash on hand as of the 30th of June 2021. This is sufficient capital to continue to progress the osteoarthritis Phase 3 pivotal and Para-08 clinical trials, the MPS clinical studies, and the pipeline research for potentially using IPPS in indications for acute respiratory disease and chronic heart failure. Once we have finalised this process with the US FDA, the company will have a clearer view on the financial impact of the clinical program and will update the market as required. Next question, Donna. Is the focus on the rat GLP study a normal part of the process, or are there any other reasons why the FDA would be quite particular on this issue?
Thank you, Justin. The non-clinical study requirements are that we look at more than one species. One of those species is almost always a rodent, and for our studies, we did use rats. I'd like to stress that the question that is outstanding with the FDA for further clarification regards a tissue finding in one organ without associated clinical side effects in the rats and no deaths in the study. Additionally, there were no similar findings noted in dogs that were part of the non-clinical study program as well. And in our clinical experience, which consists of approximately 600 clinical subjects, there are no suggestions of any impact of this finding in the clinic. So while we need to provide the clarification that the agency is asking regarding this finding, we don't expect this to be of clinical significance. And we also understand that the best evidence of understanding whether something is clinically significant is to monitor it carefully in the clinical program. The discussion around the significance in the rat as well as the mitigation in the clinical program are the topic of the response that we will be providing to the agency within the next 30 days.
Thanks, Donna. Next question. Paradigm stated it had several experts review and assist with the previous response to the FDA. Why is the company confident the response this time around will be received more positively?
Thank you, Justin. Well, first of all, I would like to reiterate that the responses previously submitted to the agency were received positively. I mentioned that we responded to 6 questions, and only one of these questions has come back to us with further clarification. We have convened our panel of experts to assure that we provide the agency with all of the evidence they need to understand the lack of significance of this tissue finding and our ability to very thoroughly mitigate for such a finding in the clinic. So given our experience to date with 26 non-clinical studies, 6 prior questions, and now coming down to a clarification around one of these studies, we feel confident that we've provided all the information to the agency that is needed to really understand how PPS works, not only from a toxicology aspect in animals, but also in humans based on a PK study we conducted this year in humans. So this aggregate information is in the IND. It will also be included in our response to the agency. We do believe that this will provide the final clarification that the FDA needs in order to give us clearance to proceed.
Okay, thanks, Donna. Another question on the review process. Has Paradigm considered seeking the advice of an additional independent consultant to review the remaining question to see if they can shed any further light on the issue?
Thank you, Justin. Yes, I mentioned we previously worked with a panel of experts, not only from the clinical side, but also on the non-clinical side. We have expanded that panel to include some very well-acknowledged experts in the field, including individuals with former FDA and current FDA relationships. So that is often very insightful when it is time to put our responses together so that they're not only valid scientifically, but also from the regulatory perspective, presented in a way that the FDA understands our intent and our plans for the clinical trial.
Thanks, Donna. Another question, is there a risk that the agency could require more testing if they are not satisfied with Paradigm's response?
I think the risk of they're requesting more non-clinical work before going into the clinic is extremely unlikely. I've mentioned a couple of times that we've done a large number of studies in 2 species looking at everything they've asked for the portfolio around injectable PPS. So we fully expect that the questions that we have will be answered by the existing non-clinical work. Obviously, we need to provide this information to the agency in such a way that it's very clear to them that the answers they're looking for are in the data that already exists.
Thanks, Donna. There's a question around have agreements been executed or put in place for clinical research organisations in Europe and in Australia?
Thanks, Justin. Yes, a lot of activity has been going on since not only the IND submission, but even before then. We have selected and are in contract with a clinical research organization that has been working with us for several months to identify sites and do site feasibility. We've also established our relationship with the biometrics or statistical group that is working with us. Work has been done to set up the databases that will be required for the study, the randomization scheme. So all of this background work has been done so that when we receive the clearance from the FDA, we will very quickly be able to move into the active site activity, which will allow for enrollment of patients. And this work for preparation for patient enrollment has been going on simultaneously across the US, Australia, and now Europe.
Okay, thanks, Donna. Might give you a break with the questions. I think I have one here possibly for Paul. Why did it take 5 days to tell the market that there was one remaining question to answer?
Thanks, Justin, and thank you to the person who's raised the question. When we receive the response from the FDA, one of the tasks that we have to do is to a large extent, try and understand and decipher exactly what the agency is asking us. If we don't make that determination, it can lead to further questions and back and forth seeking clarification. But I'm very confident, as Donna said. We had 6 questions. We went through the same process, which is a very laborious process, which does take time, unfortunately, but we have to go through and decipher the question, assemble the experts, point the FDA into the direction of the necessary data with explanations and expert opinions, and put all of that together, and then respond to the agency. So while it is one question, and we acknowledge that, which we think is a very positive and shows significant progress with the FDA, that one question goes through the same process of where we need to sit down, decipher, work out exactly what the agency is asking for. And we also have to engage with our regulatory and clinical and preclinical consultants who are largely in the United States, and they're generally not available at a moment's notice to write a response. So we need to sit down with them, go through the issue, make sure that we have thorough understanding of what's being asked, thorough understanding that we can answer the question, and then come back to the market and say, we do have one question and we're confident that we can answer that question within the month. And that confidence comes from the work that has been done over the past 4 days, which is contacting the clinical, preclinical, toxicology experts in the United States and asking them to write opinions, go through the data with us, and will they be available to respond and provide the necessary information back to the agency within the month. We don't want to just say we have one question that's outstanding and leave it to the interpretation of the market that we can answer that question within the 1 month. We take a more thorough investigation of the question before we get to this position. So it is, and hopefully everyone now understands, as we've taken everyone through this process starting in February 2020 to today, it is a process that the agency goes through the IND submission in extreme detail, and we've seen that through the questions. And just to remind everyone, with an IND, we're submitting the clinical trial protocol and all of the available information that has been done with the drug and all of the clinical data to date that we've received. We also present the manufacturing details. So the agency has all of the background information on how the product was produced and QC'd, etc. And then we also provide the non-clinical data, which is these 26 additional preclinical studies. So a large amount of data distilled down to one question. We want to make sure that we've got the right people with the right kudos, if you like, to impress the agency that these people have reviewed the data and they concur that the observation that the agency is querying is not likely to be seen in a clinical state in the future. So it is a very laborious, it is a very time-consuming process to make sure that you have everything absolutely right when you go back to the agency. So I hope that answers the question, but if not, maybe the user can type another question. But thank you for the question.
Thank you, Paul. I think another question for your attention, Paul. When is the company likely to look to partner with a big pharma for knee osteoarthritis?
Thank you, Justin, and again, thank you for the person who's asked the question. Our immediate goal is to get this IND open, and we think once the IND is open, the number of pharma companies that we have had discussions with thus far will turn their attention to more intense discussions with the company over partnering. So we're not looking. We have one partnering discussion later this week, and our position will be, let's get the IND open, and I think the partners want to see the IND open as well. We've been open and transparent with the partners or potential partners to date, explaining to them the same process that I've just explained. We've been through this review process. We have one final question. This is the question that's being asked, and once that's resolved and the IND is open, then the potential partners would be more willing to sit down and talk to us in more specific detail. So it's on our agenda, and we do have pharma companies who have expressed interest, and some have said that Paradigm has done an amazing job in a short period of time to come this far. But as I say, we are waiting for the IND to be open to demonstrate that we have clearance through the FDA, we have clearance in Australia, clearance in Europe, and I think that will be a very significant position for the company to be in, and certainly increase the value of the asset with an IND being open. Thanks, Justin.
Okay, thank you, Paul. A few more questions. These might be maybe a bit more for Donna. At any point, is there a possibility of a fast-track avenue with the FDA available to Paradigm?
Yes, I think that fast track would be valuable to the FDA at the time of NDA submission. It's not useful at the time of IND submission, but certainly when we submit our NDA, it would be ideal to explore fast track designation to shorten the review time of the registration's application.
And Donna, I think we, our regulatory team, have plans to submit a fast track post the opening of the IND, but of course it's not appropriate timing to do it.
Yes, that's under discussion. Yeah. Correct. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, another question. What is the timeline for commencement of the phase 3 trials in Europe and Australia?
I'll take that. So the timeline for Australia, we've said by the end of this year. The timeline for Europe, we've not yet disclosed, as we're still working on some areas around various ethics approvals and figuring out those timelines. They do vary by country. So as soon as we have more information around the timing in Europe, we will let the market know.
Thank you, Donna. Another question. Why did it take for the FDA to request the non-clinical GLP data? i.e., why wasn't this data prepared years ago prior to the commencement of the pre-IND meeting in 2020?
I'll take that one. So the FDA has previously approved the oral formulation of PPS Almiron, which is used for bladder cystitis. That was approved many years ago. The FDA has not approved an injectable form of PPS, although the injectable form has been approved in other countries. So for an IND and subsequent NDA, the FDA needed information around the drug's behavior by the route of administration being proposed for the clinic, the treatment dose and plan similar to that being used in the clinic, and that sort of portfolio did not exist for PPS. So during our meeting with the FDA, we did discuss a good deal of historical data. The historical data were either the oral formulation and not injectable, or so old that they were not GLP studies, which are needed in order to be assured of the interpretation. So we agreed at the request of the FDA to conduct the appropriate GLP non-clinical studies to provide a full portfolio for the non-clinical understanding of PPS.
And Donna, I might just add that when we had our IND meeting with the FDA back in February 2020, we did, along with our regulatory consultants, assume that the toxicology data that was on file would be able to be cross-referenced by Paradigm. And the agency took a different view, and they, as you've just explained, wanted to see GLP studies done across a wide range of different study types for the injectable version of PPS. So it's obvious and sometimes seems like a straightforward situation, but obviously we used every consultant that we could at the time, and we believed that we would have sufficient arguments to bridge to other studies. The agency took a different view, but having said that, I think it's a testament to the regulatory and the preclinical group within Paradigm to be able to, during a global pandemic, be able to assemble everything and have 26 preclinical studies done within 12 months, which was an amazing achievement. So I don't think most people would realise just some of the complications and difficulties that were faced by the group, but to get that outcome within 12 months was truly amazing. Thanks, Justin.
Okay, thanks, Paul and Donna. Another question: how does the response causing FDA concern from your non-clinical trials compare with trials of oral dosages of PPS?
I'll take that. So if I understand, the question is there any relationship between this question and the experience with oral PPS?
Yes, that would be my read.
That's the question. Mm-hmm. It appears unrelated to anything that has been reported with the oral formulation. As I mentioned earlier, this is a tissue finding in one species only. I'd like to be clear that we've looked at rats and dogs and have not seen this in dogs, and we have not seen this in the clinic. The oral formulation, Elmiron, has its own toxicity profile, and that may very well be because the pharmacokinetics are different and the bioavailability differ with that drug. So not related, and as I said early, likely to not be of any clinical significance on our end.
Thanks, Donna. I think this question is for you also, Donna. Would the FDA require 30 days to respond to our response?
Well, the responses from the FDA are within 30 days. Our experience to date has been that means at 30 days. So all I can say is that we would expect to have more information within 30 days of submitting our response. But as I mentioned earlier, particularly since COVID, almost everything with the FDA has been through written questions and written responses, including our Type C meeting in December. And so those responses work on the FDA's response cycle, which is within 30 days.
Thanks, Donna. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your participation this morning. We'll bring the Q&A session to a close and take the time to now close the call. A recording of today's presentation will be available on the company website following this meeting. And we thank you for your participation this morning and for your continued interest in Paradigm Biopharmaceuticals.